Welcome to Reality Check. I'm Wang Guan. For someone who's followed U.S.-China relations for the past decade, I must confess I'm more perplexed now than I've been most of the times about where this relationship is going. Will the two countries be compelled to cooperate coming out of the global pandemic, or are they locked in for more confrontation going through an election year? We'll talk to a top expert about this, but first, here are some facts. If we go beyond the headlines and political sound bites, on the economic side of the relations, we still see some resilience. Take trade, for example. Amid Trump's China trade war and Beijing's retaliations in 2018, bilateral trade actually reached an all-time high, $634 billion. That is one of the highest bilateral trade numbers ever recorded. Of course, it took time for the effects of tariffs to kick in, and for the following year, trade volume went down, but it was still not far from the recent peak. In fact, in 2019, Americans bought more goods from China than from any other country, by far. Meanwhile, trade in services continue to grow as well, though at a slower pace. It is a mixed picture in two-way investment. According to Rhodium Group, in 2019, Chinese direct investment in the U.S. dropped to $5 billion, the lowest level in a decade, due to Beijing's outbound policies and U.S. regulatory scrutiny. However, U.S. direct investment in China went up to $14 billion as U.S. firms continue to bet on the Chinese consumer market and saw opportunities from eased restrictions on foreign ownership in sectors such as automotive and finance. Then there is this much talked about relocation of supply chains. Amid the pandemic, U.S. officials repeatedly asked the U.S. companies to move out of China on national security concerns. But how many U.S. companies actually wanted to do that?
Less than 1% say that they're going to do that. There's 70% say they have no plans to make changes to sourcing and production. Overwhelmingly, people still value and plan to continue with their sourcing and supply chain operations in China.
Many fear that this economic resilience, or what remains of it, could be eroded if politics continues to get in the way. There's this ongoing politicization and blame game surrounding COVID-19. For the first time in decades, the expulsion of journalists from each other's countries. And Beijing considers some of Washington's moves provocative to its national security interests, from the Taipei Act that helps Taiwan keep its diplomatic relations, and the Taiwan Travel Act that allowed high-level U.S. officials to visit Taiwan and vice versa, to legislation on Hong Kong and Xinjiang. In addition, since 2018, U.S. naval vessels sailed through the Taiwan Strait at a frequency of once a month. During the Obama era, such exercises were done once a year. At the end of the day, it is also about how people on both sides want this relationship to go, or it should be. A recent Pew survey shows a record 66% of Americans have negative views of China, the highest rate since the survey began in 2005. But if you break it down by age groups, positive impressions on China are more common among younger Americans. Likewise, there are anti-U.S. sentiments among some Chinese, but in 2018 through 2019, a record number of Chinese students went to study in the U.S., despite stricter visa restrictions for some. Chinese students remain the largest source of foreign students in U.S. higher learning institutions. Now back to the big question. Given these different and sometimes opposing dynamics, where are U.S.-China relations headed? I don't have all the answers, but I know someone who might. Dr. Cheng Li is the director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. He's also a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Dr. Li, so good to see you.
Happy to see you here.
You've followed U.S.-China relations for decades. How would you characterize the current state of this relationship?
I would call a vicious cycle of three rings or three areas. Now, these three rings or areas have mutually reinforced the tensions or the tense problems of each of them. Now, let me very quickly mention these three rings or three areas, which I call, all started with the word D. The first is devastating coronavirus situation in the United States. And number two is dire partisan infighting in U.S. presidential election. And number three is a dangerous deterioration of U.S. China relations. So we are in a situation, it's really unprecedented since China-U.S. established the diplomatic relationship 40 years ago.
I want to get your predictions on where U.S.-China relations are headed, both in the short term and in the long term.
Well, short term, I think that you probably should not expect too much changes. This is kind of, election season will reinforce this kind of tension or criticism. Even Donald Trump cannot get re-elected, but the tensions on the technological competition, this kind of geopolitical landscape change, and also the concern about China's very aggressive foreign policy from U.S. perspective will continue. And then even Democratic Party win the election, the Republican Party will go after in terms of its policy toward China. So it's not so easy to change the dynamic. So that's the near-term situation. Now for the long term, I would say probably will be a little bit different. I think people's mindset may change because regardless of how you define that the coronavirus, this is certainly is a historical moment. To a certain extent, is the humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. So people's view may change. So the real enemy is neither China nor United States from the other side, but really the common enemy, which is the virus. So international public good, whether it be climate change, to deal with the common challenge of international refugees, and also the drug traffics, and the cybersecurity, energy security, and nuclear non-proliferation, and most importantly, cooperation on the public health, such as right now. I think all these things will be a positive force, push for cooperation. So in that regard, for kind of a medium term or long term, I'm actually optimistic.
All right. And then how do you assess the current U.S.-China security relations? What are the biggest risk factors?
Well, the biggest risk factor certainly is Taiwan. I think that because the recent resolution in the U.S. Congress, Taiwan Act 2019, is a close move to, sounds like, acknowledge Taiwan as a nation state. So certainly this is challenging China's bottom line. But from U.S. side, I mean, many people also critical about what happened in terms of China's exercise in South China Sea, maybe some of the exercise in East China Sea, and the cyber security issues, and etc. These are all very contentious issues. Now, of course, I don't want to give it sensationalism. The war scenario is maybe only 5 to 10%.
Dr. Cheng Li, Director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for your insight. It was so good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And in an open letter to leaders on both sides, Dr. Cheng Li and 70 scholars urged the caution for deploying political capital to fight COVID-19. The letter said, relationships can take years to nurture and only moments to destroy. And that would do it for this edition of Reality Check. For more, log on to our website at cgtn.com or to your favorite social media platform and search for Reality Check with me, Wang Guan. I want to thank all of you for watching, and I will see you again soon.